Renee had always been meticulous. A retired librarian with a sharp memory and an even sharper eye for detail, she had balanced her checkbook with the same precision she once used to organize entire archives. But the stroke changed everything, subtly, then all at once. When her hands trembled one morning over her tea and the room tilted sideways, she had no idea that her life's greatest battle wouldn't be for her health, but for her autonomy. It began with a dropped teacup. One moment she was reading the newspaper, the next, warm liquid pooled in her lap as the cup rolled onto the floor, her fingers still tingling. At 70, Renee was no stranger to minor stumbles or the occasional forgetfulness. But this was different. The dizziness lingered. The fear followed quickly behind. By the time she called for help, her voice sounded wrong even to her. Slurred, sluggish, like her mouth couldn't keep up with her mind. The paramedics came quickly, their kindness efficient and practiced. In the hospital, the words mild stroke were spoken like a reassurance, but to Renee it sounded like a warning siren muffled under a blanket. Nina, her only daughter, arrived within hours. Businesslike and brisk, Nina sat beside her mother's hospital bed with her work tablet still open on her lap, already asking about bills, passwords, and whether Renee had set up a power of attorney. "Just in case," she said. "It's only temporary, honey." At the time, it made sense. Renee couldn't navigate stairs yet, let alone online banking. When Nina suggested staying for a while, handling the essentials, bills, groceries, appointments, Renee agreed, grateful not to face everything alone. They moved slowly together through recovery. Walker-assisted steps, physical therapy sessions, small victories like buttoning a blouse again, but even small victories can be overshadowed by subtle losses. As Nina began managing more details for efficiency's sake, Renee found herself asking for her own account balances. "It's handled," Nina would assure her, brushing it off with a smile that didn't quite meet her eyes. The smile worked the first time, the second time too, but the third time, when Nina changed the phone plan to something simpler, Renee started to feel the walls closing in. There were explanations for everything, reasonable ones. After all, it wasn't like Renee could drive herself to the bank, and online banking felt like a chore now. Nina offered to consolidate accounts to make things easier. And it was easier, wasn't it? At least at first. Still, there were moments when Renee stared out the window of her own home and felt something intangible slipping through her fingers. She couldn't name it then, not quite. It wasn't just independence, though that was part of it. It was something older, deeper, the steady foundation of self she had built through decades of knowing what was hers to manage. When she returned from a checkup one afternoon to find her checkbook no longer in the kitchen drawer, but inside Nina's locked office, something inside her stirred. She didn't say anything. Not yet. But as she sat down slowly in her chair, legs still aching from the walk, her thoughts were sharper than they'd been in weeks. The stroke had taken her balance, but something else, quieter, more dangerous, was trying to take her voice. And Renee, librarian or not, had spent a lifetime learning how to speak up when it mattered most. The recovery period blurred into routine. Nina had taken a leave from work, or so she said, and set up camp in the guest room with her laptop, planner, and a constant stream of phone calls on mute. Renee appreciated the support, she did, but there was a subtle shift in the air, the kind that creeps in while you're distracted by gratitude. Nina didn't just help, she began to rearrange. It started with small things. She moved the spice rack, reorganized the living room to create safer walking paths, and canceled Renee's old newspaper subscription in favor of an online version, though Renee hadn't asked for that. When the gas bill didn't show up in the mail one week, Nina explained that she'd switched everything to paperless and linked it to a new email account they both could easily access. Renee tried to smile. She was tired after all, and maybe it was easier this way. Passwords followed soon after. Nina set up a shared document, color-coded and filled with logins for everything from Renee's utility providers to her library app. "We'll keep it secure," she promised. "Just a safety net." But when Renee tried to log into her bank account a week later, her password no longer worked. Nina waved it off. "I'll look into it. There's probably just a verification thing." But the access never returned. At the pharmacy, Renee reached into her purse to pay for her prescription and found only her grocery loyalty card and a few dollars in crumpled bills. Her debit card, the one she'd used for years without fail, was missing. At home, she asked about it casually. Nina didn't miss a beat. "I've got it safe in the drawer. You don't need to worry about carrying all that around right now." Renee's chest tightened, though she said nothing. "It's just help," she reminded herself. Nina was her daughter. She meant well. She had a right to worry. But that night, when Renee checked her bedroom drawer for her passport and found it missing too, the gratitude began to curdle. She brought it up gently over dinner, mentioning that she wanted to handle her upcoming eye appointment herself. Nina paused mid-chew, fork suspended, then gave that practiced, soothing smile. "Of course, honey. Just let me know if you need the insurance card. I've got all the important things tucked away for now, just to keep things in one place." It wasn't malicious, not obviously. But Renee could feel it. The way Nina called the shots, the way every favor seemed to come with a new boundary. She now had to ask before accessing things she once managed with ease. She no longer kept her own schedule. It was coordinated through Nina's color-coded planner and Google Calendar alerts. When Carol, a former colleague, called to check in, Renee hesitated before answering. The phone had been acting strange, missing calls, forwarding others. She nearly cried at the sound of her friend's voice. Carol was sharp as ever, living alone and thriving. "Don't let her run your life, Renee," she said with a chuckle. "You're not done yet." Renee laughed softly, but her heart caught on the words. Not done yet. She clung to that phrase as she hung up, staring at the locked drawer across the hall. Just a little help had turned into something else. And Renee, quietly, began to take note. Renee stood in front of her laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The bank's website loaded quickly, as usual, but when she entered her usual credentials, the screen flashed red. Incorrect password. Try again. She tried twice more, carefully checking for typos. Still nothing. She sat back, staring at the screen with a sinking feeling in her gut. Nina was just in the next room, typing furiously on her work laptop. When Renee mentioned the login problem, her daughter looked up briefly and said, "Oh, I had to reset it last week. There was a weird security notification. I'll send you the new one later." But later never came. And when Renee asked again the next day, Nina seemed irritated. "You don't need to worry about that stuff right now. Focus on getting stronger." That was the moment it stopped being a simple favor. Renee had spent her life teaching others how to access information, how to take responsibility, how to navigate systems confidently. Now she couldn't even see her own balance. She opened her email to try to reset the password herself, but found the recovery notifications went to a different address, one she didn't recognize. Her phone wasn't much help either. Nina had switched her plan recently, saying the old one was outdated and too expensive. The new phone was simpler, fewer apps, a cleaner interface. But many of the features Renee once relied on were gone. Her calendar no longer buzzed with reminders. Her contacts list was half empty, and every app now required two-step verification that Nina had linked to her own number. Renee sat quietly on the porch that evening, bundled in her favorite gray shawl, nursing a cup of tea she hadn't brewed herself. The garden looked the same, geraniums blooming, the old bird feeder swaying gently in the wind. But everything else felt out of rhythm. She felt like a visitor in her own house. Not a prisoner, not quite, but certainly no longer the one holding the keys. It wasn't that Nina was cruel. She cooked meals, scheduled appointments, even clipped her mother's toenails with care. But somewhere in all the helpfulness, there was a firm hand closing around Renee's independence. "You're too old to worry about this," Nina had joked once, tapping the laptop closed. "Let me do the heavy lifting." That phrase stuck with her, too old to worry, as if concern expired after a certain age, as if autonomy had an upper limit. Later that night, Renee rummaged through her desk drawer and found an old notebook she used to keep for passwords. She flipped through its pages, now outdated, most of them useless. Still, seeing them in her own handwriting sparked something. Memory, ownership, identity. She began writing again, quietly, methodically, tracking what she still had access to and what had vanished. One small note she scribbled at the bottom of the page. Find out who the phone is registered to now. She wasn't sure yet what she'd do with that information, but the act of writing it, of claiming some tiny part of her own digital life again, felt like a thread she could follow back to herself. The grocery store smelled faintly of lemons and floor polish. Renee walked the familiar aisles, her cane tapping lightly against the tile as she selected a few essentials: eggs, cereal, her favorite cinnamon tea. She smiled at the cashier, a polite young man with a name tag that read Leo, and placed her reusable bag on the counter. Everything felt normal, almost pleasant, until she slid her card into the reader and the screen beeped. Transaction declined. She blinked, sure it was a mistake. "Let me try that again," she said softly, pressing the card in more firmly. Another beep. Another decline. Leo looked apologetic. "It happens sometimes," he offered kindly. "Maybe it's a chip issue?" Flustered, Renee fished through her wallet, finally handing over the last of the cash Nina had given her earlier that week. It wasn't enough. She had to put back the bread and the shampoo. Her cheeks burned as she pushed her card aside, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach, not from embarrassment, but from realization. At home, she asked Nina about the card. "Oh, I meant to tell you," Nina replied breezily. "There were some weird charges. Probably just subscription stuff, so I froze the account temporarily. You've been signed up for so many things, Mom. Magazines, delivery apps. It adds up." "But I didn't authorize—" "I know," Nina interrupted, holding up a hand. "That's why I'm taking care of it." The words were gentle, but the tone was final. Later that afternoon, Renee sat alone in the sunroom, a blanket over her knees and the untouched grocery bag beside her. She'd always loved this space, light-filled, quiet, filled with the rustling of the garden. But now, it felt like a holding pen. She reached for her notebook and scribbled another line. Card frozen. No notice. Groceries declined. She remembered her weekly coffee shop visits, the ones Nina now called luxuries. The trip she'd been planning for months to visit her oldest friend. The one she hadn't mentioned in weeks, because Nina had made it clear it was impractical. Bit by bit, her choices were being labeled unnecessary. Her wants became wasteful. Her plans, indulgences. Nina had begun referring to the weekly cash envelope as an allowance. Renee tried to laugh it off, but it stung every time. It wasn't the amount, it was the idea. She hadn't lived her life budgeting like a teenager, waiting on lunch money. She had worked, saved, managed. She had lived independently for 5 decades. Now she had to ask for shampoo. That night, as Nina prepared a dinner of quinoa and steamed chicken, Renee asked for her card back. Nina froze for a split second, then smiled without teeth. "I'll get it to you tomorrow, promise." Renee nodded, but her trust no longer reached that far. She wasn't angry, yet. But the ground had shifted. What had once been framed as protection now looked more like possession. The envelope was left on the kitchen counter every Monday morning, always folded shut and labeled with the date in Nina's sharp handwriting. Inside was a crisp assortment of small bills, just enough for groceries, maybe a haircut if she skipped the bakery. Renee never asked for it. Nina had simply started the routine one week, saying, "This will make things easier." No discussion, no agreement, just a decision, handed over like pocket money. Renee picked up the envelope this time and turned it over in her hand. It reminded her uncomfortably of her own childhood, when her father would give her coins for errands with the same unstated expectation. Use it wisely, and don't ask for more. The implication was clear. The money was finite, and so was her freedom to use it. That week, Renee tried to make it stretch. She skipped the cafe where she used to enjoy a warm scone and crossword puzzles. Instead, she brewed lukewarm coffee at home and sat alone at the table, staring out at the garden. The emptiness wasn't just about the cafe. It was about choice. Even her routines had been deemed luxuries now. When she asked Nina if she could take a small trip to visit Carol, a plan they'd once discussed warmly, Nina shook her head gently. "We need to keep spending tight," she said, slicing carrots without looking up. "It's not a good time for extras." Extras. That's what her memories, friendships, and autonomy had become. Renee nodded and quietly added, "Trip denied, Carol visit extra to her growing notebook of notes and subtle humiliations." Her list was getting longer. Longer than she ever thought it would. Later that afternoon, Renee found a pair of shoes missing from the hallway. They weren't expensive, just her old walking shoes with the worn soles she still liked to wear for gardening. "Nina had decluttered," she said. "They weren't good for your balance anyway, Mom." That was the final straw that week. Not the money, not even the canceled plans, but the shoes. Those shoes had carried her through parks, city sidewalks, and library steps. They were hers, and they were gone. That night, while Nina watched TV in the living room, Renee sat quietly at her desk, the one she'd slowly reclaimed from beneath piles of organized clutter. She took out the envelope, unfolded the bills, and counted them carefully. Then she wrote the total down, followed by a line she underlined twice. "This is not a gift. This is a limit." She didn't cry. She didn't rage. That wasn't her way. But as she slid the envelope back into the drawer, she made herself a quiet promise. If her choices were being trimmed down to weekly rations, then she would start rationing her patience in return. Because an allowance, she realized, was never just about money. It was about control. And Renee had no intention of being managed. The days blurred into sameness, meals portioned with clinical precision, appointments placed neatly into Nina's digital calendar, and casual check-ins disguised as monitoring. Renee found herself speaking less, partly out of fatigue, partly because it often made no difference. When she expressed preferences, where to eat, what to wear, which errands to run, they were gently overridden, sometimes with humor, sometimes with silence. She began to shrink into the corners of her own life. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It came in increments. She no longer insisted on choosing her groceries. Nina ordered them online now. She didn't argue when her knitting supplies were packed away for decluttering. She even stopped asking about the password list. Each small concession was easier than the mild sigh or dismissive laugh that came when she asked questions. The irony wasn't lost on her. In her years at the library, she had helped hundreds of people find answers, complicated ones, messy ones, personal ones. She had taught them how to locate missing documents, trace forgotten facts, and claim their own narratives. Yet now, she couldn't even access her own phone records without permission. She tried once to call her old insurance agent, just to ask a question about her policy. The call dropped midway through. When she tried again, the number was blocked. Nina later explained, without a hint of guilt, that she'd set filters to avoid scams. "You're too trusting, Mom," she said. "It's just safer this way." Renee smiled faintly and said nothing, but she wrote it down in her notebook. Call blocked. Number flagged as scam without consent. Even her voice felt smaller. At dinner, she found herself choosing silence over conversation. It wasn't worth correcting Nina's misremembered stories or voicing her own opinions anymore. Those conversations always turned into soft lectures about letting go or learning to accept help. The words sounded kind but rang hollow, like a lullaby meant to put her thoughts to sleep. The worst part wasn't the restrictions. It was the erasure. Slowly, subtly, her sense of agency was being rewritten. Her habits reframed as outdated, her needs treated as complications. Even her personality began to feel like something preserved in a jar, acknowledged, but no longer alive. When she emailed an old book club friend to ask about meeting up, she received no reply. She later found the email in her drafts folder, unsent. Whether it had been forgotten or intercepted, she couldn't be sure. That night, she wrote another line in her notebook. Email unsent. Missed connection. Suspect interference. Still, she made her tea just the way she liked it. 1 sugar splash of milk, steeped 5 minutes. She watched the birds each morning, took notes in her small blue journal, and whispered affirmations she never shared aloud. They were small rituals, but they were hers. And in those quiet spaces, between the silences she had conceded, Renee began to make room for something else. Not rebellion, not yet, but awareness. The kind that grew steadily, like a root under stone, biding its time. The conversation started innocently enough. Renee, sorting through old mail, found a flyer from a community legal aid clinic. It mentioned free services for seniors, estate planning, fraud protection, financial reviews. Something about the wording stirred a sense of possibility. Not desperation, not accusation, just curiosity. Over lunch, she brought it up casually, her voice light. "I was thinking of having someone take a quick look at my accounts, just to be safe. My friend Helen did that last year and said it helped her sleep better." She waited for Nina's reaction, eyes fixed on the salad she barely touched. The change in her daughter was instant. Nina stiffened, her fork frozen mid-air. "Why?" she asked flatly. "You don't trust me?" Renee tried to explain, but the conversation had already turned. "I've done everything for you," Nina continued, her tone brittle. "I put my job on hold, my life on hold. And now you think I'm doing something wrong? No, Is this about the money?" Nina snapped. "Because if it is, I think we need to talk about who's actually paying the bills right now." The words weren't shouted, but they cut all the same. Renee sat back, stunned by the intensity, by the anger that had been lying just under the surface this whole time. She'd expected confusion, maybe resistance, but not this. When Nina left the room to take a call, Renee stayed at the table, her appetite gone. Her heart beat fast, not from fear but from recognition. This wasn't just about logistics anymore, it was about control, and what happened when that control was questioned. She returned to her notebook and wrote in deliberate, even script. Mentioning legal review triggered disproportionate anger. Defensive. Accusatory. Red flag. That night, the atmosphere in the house grew quieter but heavier. Nina didn't speak much during dinner and left early for bed. Renee washed the dishes alone, moving slowly, letting the hot water run over her hands longer than necessary. She stared out the window into the dark yard and thought about how fast concern could become custody. The next morning, she called Carol again, using her old landline, which Nina hadn't bothered to disconnect. "You were right," she said quietly. It's not just help anymore. Carol didn't ask for details. She simply said, "Time to take back what's yours. Start with information. End with action." Renee nodded as if Carol could see her. She didn't feel brave yet, not really, but she felt something different. A shift. A choice. Before breakfast, she walked into the guest room where Nina was working and asked, "Would you mind if I handled the grocery order this week?" Nina gave her a look, half surprised, half suspicious, but nodded. "Fine, just don't go overboard." Renee smiled and walked away before she could say anything else. It was a small ask, barely a step, but it was hers, and it marked the start of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Momentum. Carol arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, punctual as always, her wiry frame stepping out of a taxi with the brisk efficiency of someone who had never let age slow her down. Renee met her at the door with a cautious smile, her heart swelling just a little at the sight of her old colleague's teal scarf and wind-blown hair. Carol's hug was firm, grounding. "You look good," she said, giving Renee a once-over. Too thin, but still sharp. Nina hadn't been thrilled when Renee mentioned the visit. "You didn't tell me you were inviting someone," she'd said with a tight-lipped smile. "I just wish you'd let me know ahead of time." But Renee had stood her ground. "She's an old friend. We're having tea, that's all." Nina had left shortly after, muttering about errands. They settled into the sunroom with tea and a small plate of store-bought cookies. Renee didn't have access to the baking apps anymore. Carol sipped, studied her, then leaned forward. "Now, tell me what's really going on." Renee hesitated. There were so many ways to explain it, some soft, some sharp, but she opted for honesty. She described the frozen accounts, the missing card, the allowance. She described the tone Nina used now, the way decisions were made for her rather than with her, the loss of small freedoms that added up to something bigger. Carol listened without interruption, only nodding now and then. When Renee finished, Carol leaned back, her expression unreadable. "You're being parented, not supported," she said finally. "It's subtle. That's why it works. But it's not love. It's control dressed up as care." The words landed like a pin dropped in a quiet room. Renee exhaled, slowly. "I let her. I was tired and everything seemed harder, and I thought maybe I was better off not dealing with it." "That's how it always starts," Carol replied. "But now you know better. And you're not done, Renee. You're still sharp. You're still you." They talked for another hour, about books, old library scandals, former patrons who had aged with more grace than most politicians. For the first time in weeks, Renee felt like herself, respected, listened to, and above all, real. Before leaving, Carol pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse. "This is the name of a legal aid attorney. She's discreet. Call her when you're ready." Renee took it with trembling fingers, not out of fear but out of recognition. She was at the edge of something that had once looked like surrender, but now looked more like a starting line. That evening Nina returned, asking casually, "Did you have fun?" Renee nodded. "Very much. Carol reminded me of who I used to be." Nina laughed lightly. "Well, I'm sure you gave her an earful." "No," Renee said, smoothing out the folded paper in her pocket. "I mostly listened, and it was exactly what I needed." 2 days after Carol's visit, Renee dressed in her neatly pressed navy coat and comfortable flats, tucked her notebook into her tote bag, and took a taxi downtown. She didn't mention the trip to Nina. There would be too many questions, too much smiling concern, too much spinning of her decision into something reckless. Instead, she simply said she was going out for a walk and left before any objections could catch up to her. The bank lobby was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to soothe her when she handled ledgers and filing systems in the library's back office. She waited patiently, clutching her number slip in one hand and her cane in the other. When it was her turn, she stepped up to the desk and met the eyes of the young man behind the glass. His name tag read Jordan. His smile was warm, but not condescending. "How can I help you today?" "I'd like to review my account activity," she said, her voice steady. "And I'd prefer paper copies, if possible." Jordan raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Of course. Do you have identification with you?" Renee handed over her ID and quietly held her breath. The login screen came up. Jordan frowned slightly. "It looks like your account has limited access permissions tied to a co-managed profile. Do you know a Nina Laird?" "My daughter," Renee replied. "She's listed as primary controller on the digital access," he said carefully. "Your name is on the account, but notifications, transaction approvals, and two-factor authentications are routed through her profile. You're technically a secondary." Renee blinked, her mind racing to catch up with what that meant. She was still on the account, barely, but not in control. "Can I see the last 3 months of transactions?" she asked, swallowing the tightness in her throat. Jordan nodded and printed a thick stack of statements, slipping them into an envelope and sliding them across the counter. "If you'd like to schedule time with a financial advisor or make changes, we can assist. But you'll need to authorize identity confirmation first." "I understand," she said quietly. "This is just a start." Back home, Renee locked the door to her study and spread the papers out across her desk. Page by page, line by line, she traced every transaction. Streaming services she didn't recognize, automatic withdrawals for budget management software, and multiple transfers marked as household support, some to accounts she didn't know existed. She made notes in her journal. She cross-referenced old receipts she had kept in a drawer. She felt like a detective in her own life, solving a mystery she hadn't even realized was unfolding right in front of her. That night, Nina asked about her day. "Did you go out?" Renee smiled over her tea. "Just a walk, cleared my head." And it had, more than Nina could possibly imagine. The following morning, Renee woke with a rare sense of purpose. She moved more slowly these days, but every step felt more certain now, more her own. After breakfast, while Nina took a conference call in the guest room, Renee quietly pulled out her notebook and reviewed the notes from the bank. Nothing dramatic had happened, not yet. But something had shifted. She wasn't asking anymore. She was investigating. Her first move was to request paper statements for all her utility bills. She called each company directly, waiting on hold for what felt like hours in some cases, insisting on mailed copies moving forward. The agents were polite, some even surprised to be speaking to her directly. She found herself apologizing for being old-fashioned, even though she knew this wasn't about habit. It was about reclaiming control. Nina noticed the mail piling up after a few weeks. "Why are we getting all this again?" she asked one afternoon, flipping through envelopes. "I wanted to see things for myself," Renee said evenly. "It helps me stay engaged." Nina smiled, but it was tight. "You know I've got it all covered, right? This just adds more to manage." "I don't mind," Renee replied. And that was the end of it, for now. She didn't push. That wasn't her way. Instead, she moved in quiet increments. She reactivated her library card and ordered books under her name again. She downloaded the bank's mobile app onto her phone and began the process of recovering her login, step by painstaking step. She didn't tell Nina. Some things didn't need to be announced. On her next visit to the bank, Jordan greeted her with a familiar smile. "Back so soon?" "I'm starting to enjoy this," she said with a small grin. He helped her file a request to shift full digital access back under her name. "It'll take a few days to process," he explained, "and we'll need your daughter to confirm the release." "I expected that," Renee said. "I just want the process started." Back home, she contacted the legal aid attorney Carol had recommended. The woman, Laura, was calm, measured, and asked thoughtful questions. "You're not alone," she told Renee, "and you're not powerless. We see this more often than people realize." Those words stayed with her. Not powerless, not too old, not too late. Each step was small, none of it flashy, none of it confrontational, but to Renee, every one was a declaration. She wasn't giving her daughter ultimatums. She was simply preparing, reorganizing, observing, and most of all, reclaiming. That evening, Nina asked if she'd like to watch a movie together. Renee smiled and declined. "I have some reading to catch up on," she said, tapping her new library book. Nina didn't push, just nodded. Behind her closed door, Renee opened the book but didn't read. Instead, she took out her journal and wrote one clean line across the top of the page. "I am not asking for permission to exist." It began with a phone call Renee didn't intend for Nina to hear. She was in the sunroom, speaking with Laura from the legal aid clinic in low tones, confirming the next steps for transferring account ownership and drafting a basic will. The windows were open. She hadn't noticed Nina coming home early, but she knew something was wrong the moment she heard the quick, hard sound of her daughter's heels approaching the door. "Who were you talking to?" Nina asked, her voice sharp in that too calm way Renee had come to recognize. Renee turned slowly, not startled, but steady. "A legal advisor. I've been reviewing some of my accounts." Nina's eyes flashed. "Why would you do that behind my back? Don't you trust me?" "It's not about trust," Renee said, her voice low but firm. "It's about clarity, about making sure I understand what's happening with my own life." "You don't need to understand everything," Nina snapped. "That's why I've been handling it, for your benefit. You've been through a stroke. You forget things. You lose track." "I remember more than you think," Renee said, her tone steady. "Like how my name disappeared from my own statements. Like how my accounts were moved, subscriptions added, and decisions made without my input." Nina took a step back, folding her arms. "You're being paranoid." "No," Renee said quietly. "I'm being careful. There's a difference." The room went still. A bird chirped outside the window. The hum of traffic drifted in from the street, but inside everything had narrowed to a quiet standoff between mother and daughter. Renee could feel the shift in the air, like the moment just before a page is turned and the plot changes for good. "So what now?" Nina asked, her voice colder. "You're cutting me out? After everything I've done?" "No," Renee said. "I'm just taking back what's mine." There was no shouting, no slamming of doors. Nina didn't storm out. Instead, she stood silently for a moment, then turned and walked away. The sound of her footsteps faded down the hall. Renee stayed seated in the sunroom, breathing slowly, one hand resting lightly on the edge of her notebook. Her heart was racing, but she felt no regret. She hadn't accused. She hadn't attacked. She had simply drawn a line, and for the first time in months, she hadn't stepped back from it. Later that evening, she found Nina in the kitchen quietly chopping vegetables. Renee offered no explanation, and Nina didn't ask for one. They ate in silence, the air between them heavier but honest. Afterward, Renee returned to her room and wrote a new line in her journal. "Today, I said no, and I meant it." It wasn't a battle cry. It was a boundary, and it held. Renee woke before dawn the next morning. The house was quiet, wrapped in a pale blue hush as the first light crept through the curtains. She moved slowly, deliberately, her steps soft against the hardwood floor. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't walking without direction. She had a plan. And plans, no matter how small, required precision. She'd spent the past week gathering everything she needed, a list of her active accounts, copies of her most recent statements, a notarized form from the legal clinic, and the contact information for a senior housing coordinator Carol had recommended. It had taken time and patience and more than a few deep breaths, but it was all done quietly, without confrontation. It wasn't revenge she was after. It was release. Nina hadn't changed much since their last argument. If anything, she'd grown colder, her concern now laced with suspicion. She monitored deliveries, asked too many questions about Renee's calls, and commented on how withdrawn her mother seemed lately. Renee smiled politely through it all, never flinching, never rising to the bait. When the letter came from the bank confirming the ownership transfer and reinstatement of Renee's full digital access, she read it twice, then carefully slid it into a manila envelope marked final. The power was hers again, quietly, legally, fully. She found a modest studio apartment through the housing coordinator. Nothing grand, just clean, safe, and entirely her own. The deposit had been paid in cash, withdrawn from her account during one of her quiet visits to the bank. Her move-in date was set for the following Tuesday. Just 3 more days. On Sunday evening, she cooked dinner for the two of them. It wasn't a peace offering. It was closure. Chicken stew, warm bread, a hint of rosemary from the garden. Nina complimented the flavors, and for a brief moment, Renee saw the daughter she used to know, the one who used to draw butterflies in the margins of her homework, who once cried over a broken bird's wing. But the woman across the table now was not that child, and Renee was not the woman who needed permission. The next morning, Nina left for work early. Renee packed only what she needed: books, clothing, her notebook, a few personal mementos. She left the rest behind without sadness. Some things simply didn't belong to her anymore. She placed a sealed envelope on the kitchen table, held in place with the salt shaker. Then she stepped outside, locked the door for the last time, and walked down the sidewalk where the taxi waited. Inside the envelope, beneath her carefully folded house keys and the last unused cash allowance, was a single, handwritten note. "If you didn't want me in control, you shouldn't have reminded me how much I gave up." She didn't look back. The apartment was smaller than the house, but it breathed differently. There were no footsteps to brace against, no hushed tensions curdled into the walls. Just sunlight spilling across clean countertops, the low hum of a radiator, and the distant murmur of the city outside. Renee stood in the doorway for a long moment, tote bag slung over one shoulder, and simply was. She set her things down one by one. A photo of her and Carol from their library days went on the windowsill. Her journal found its new home in the desk drawer, alongside the fresh bank statements she now understood line by line. There were no locks to question, no simplified systems, no permissions to seek. For the first time in months, maybe longer, she felt the quiet rhythm of her own life returning. There was no need to contact Nina. The note said everything that needed saying. It wasn't meant to hurt. It was meant to hold up a mirror. Renee hadn't run away. She hadn't erupted or unraveled. She'd reclaimed. Carol stopped by 2 days later with a welcome plant and 2 cups of strong coffee. "Told you still had fire," she said, patting Renee's hand. "You just needed to remember where you buried it." They sat in the small kitchen nook, laughing about old patrons and the time a raccoon wandered into the reading room. For an hour, the world felt ordinary again, grounded in shared memories and restored dignity. When Carol left, Renee opened her notebook and penned the final line beneath weeks of scribbled records and reflections. "The silence is mine now, and so is the peace." Meanwhile, in the house she left behind, Nina returned from work to find the envelope on the table. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling just slightly. The house was quiet. Her mother's room was empty. The drawers were bare. There were no accusations in the note, no dramatics, just that final, clear line. If you didn't want me in control, you shouldn't have reminded me how much I gave up. For the first time, Nina sat down and didn't know what to say. Renee didn't follow up. She didn't need to. Her new life didn't revolve around explanations. It revolved around choice. She resumed her book club meetings, took the train to visit Carol's cousin in the countryside, and started volunteering at a local archive once a week. Her schedule was her own, her time, her money, her voice, hers again. She no longer needed to ask for space. She simply took it. And though she never said it aloud, she often thought of it on quiet evenings as she sipped her tea. Freedom once remembered does not ask for permission.